And so now I want to bring the discussion back to Slack. Now that we understand the attributes of SaaS systems that map to data exposure risk. So I want to hone in on some features specific to Slack that must be managed. So within Slack, there are a variety of different features that can be leveraged to, or that must be leveraged in order to manage data security risk effectively. The first is that I want to call out is Slack Connect channels. These are channels that provide opportunities for organizations to collaborate, of course, which is a boon to companies, but they also can create opportunities for external collaborators to mishandle data. You could think of external collaborators may not really know your organization's security best practices, and so may be prone to oversharing sensitive data within these channels. You could also have multiple Slack Connect channels in a workspace, or a Slack Connect channel that has multiple contributors from different organizations, which adds further to the complexity here. Slack guest accounts are another area of concern. While these are more squarely under your control, the difficulty with Slack guest accounts is that you have to play a very active role in provisioning what channels a given account is allowed to have access to at any given time. And you must also quickly deprovision these accounts once the user has left your org. Now, Slack provides tools to automate this process, but if you don't deliberately manage this process, you'll have trouble in terms of effectively doing this. The next thing to note is private channels and DMs. These are just another blind spot where it may be difficult to know exactly what's being shared and when. File attachments are perhaps one of the biggest concerns, as we talked about in the last slide, with SaaS systems storing such huge volumes of data. File attachments can be places where sensitive data are embedded, but it can be difficult to detect on the basis of metadata and name alone without the ability to actually inspect the content. So this greatly expands the search area for sensitive data within Slack. And then finally, retention is another critical consideration. By default, Slack will retain all of your messages and files for the lifetime of your instance. So this may or may not be in line with your security requirements and your compliance policies. This, of course, requires you to play an active role in deciding what retention policies make sense for you, and then ensuring that no data exceeding that retention time is kept within Slack. But keeping that default is important to note that if you keep that default there, the data will linger in your workspace and remain discoverable by any unauthorized party. So with this, Brent, my next question is, what are the factors you'd like to call out here of being a particular concern in your experience? Are there any of these that are maybe more challenging to deal with than others?
The file attachments is the big one. That's the thing that gets tripped the most frequently, at least in our environment. And and it's part of just that communication chain that I mentioned before, is that people might feel like they don't have an option. They're like, hey, I need some people to look at this file, and there's probably a better place for it. It would be better if they just left it in, say, Google Docs and linked it, but then it does create that link, right? But at least that link requires the authentication into the Google environment in order to access it. But if you put a file, if you drop the file directly in there, well, now everybody in Slack has access to it. So that's a huge problem. That's the big one for me. I don't get into the private channel area that much with our Slack implementation, and that's mostly just because HR considerations and so forth, right? It introduced a host of complexity if you're going to watch people's individual private messages and so forth. And so we don't do that at this time. So there's some residual risk there. I haven't seen any issues with the guest channels, but it's absolutely true, right? Even we have a Slack integration with Nightfall, right? And it's one of those things where I haven't seen anybody misbehave as a guest account, but it could absolutely happen. And it is most likely to happen with short-term employees who are maybe coming in as guests, or partner organizations that we're working with that we've allocated some access to. And I absolutely appreciate the fact that different companies are going to have a different risk tolerance around posting things into Slack. And this helps us kind of keep that in line, even if it's people from other organizations that might not be aware of that, right? That have a different tolerance.